The clinking of silverware on porcelain was the only sound for a full minute. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, the kind that fills a space where words should be. Across the polished mahogany of the restaurant table, my son, Mark, beamed. He was looking at his father-in-law, Richard, who was admiring the new watch on his wrist. It was a monstrous thing, a gold and steel behemoth with more dials than a cockpit. Richard turned his wrist back and forth, letting the light catch the face. The price tag, which Richard had made sure to announce, hung in the air between us, $20,000. Next to the watch on the table was a glossy brochure for a 2-week Mediterranean cruise. Another gift from my son to his wife's father. For Father's Day, Richard, a man I'd met less than a dozen times, cleared his throat. Mark, son, you've outdone yourself. Truly. Clara, you married a good man. A generous man. My daughter-in-law, Clara, preened. Mark just soaked it in, his chest puffed out. He looked proud. He looked happy. Then, as if remembering I was there, he turned to me. The brilliant smile faltered slightly, becoming something more dutiful. He reached into a small, plain paper bag by his chair. Oh, Dad, this is for you. Happy Father's Day. He slid a small, plastic-wrapped object across the table. It skidded to a stop next to my water glass. I looked down at it. It was a travel mug. A cheap, $5 plastic travel mug with a picture of a cartoon fish on it and the words, "World's Greatest Feather." The pun was so banal it was almost insulting. The plastic felt flimsy under my fingers, the seam from the mold still sharp. I looked from a flimsy cup to the $20,000 watch, from the cartoon fish to the Mediterranean cruise. I saw the flash of pity in Richard's eyes, the uncomfortable shuffle of my daughter-in-law, and the strained, almost pleading look on my son's face. In that moment, something inside me didn't break. It solidified. It became cold, hard, and clear. I picked up the mug. I turned it over in my hands. Thank you, Mark, I said, my voice perfectly even. It's very thoughtful. I took a sip of my water and placed the mug carefully next to my plate, a piece of cheap plastic incongruously set beside fine china. The conversation stammered back to life, focused again on Richard, his watch, his upcoming trip. I was a ghost at the table. I ate my sea base, nodded at the appropriate times, and listened. I listened to Richard boast about a new luxury condo project he was about to break ground on. I listened to him talk about cutting through red tape and dealing with Dinosaur City inspectors. I listened to my son, a freshly minted MBA, talk about the financial models he was building for Richard's company, the synergy, the aggressive growth strategy. And I analyzed. My name is Arthur Jennings, 58 years old, and for 35 years, I was a structural engineer. My specialty was forensic analysis. When a bridge buckled, a dam cracked, or a building settled in a way it shouldn't, they called me. My job was to find the flaw, to trace it back from the catastrophic failure to the initial, imperceptible error. A miscalculation in a load-bearing equation. A batch of substandard concrete. A single, critical bolt that was torqued incorrectly. I find the weakness. It's what I do. And sitting there, listening to the man who had just effortlessly bought my son's devotion, I realized my new project wasn't made of concrete and steel. It was made of arrogance, greed, and the dismissive smile of a man who looked at me and saw nothing of value. The plastic mug felt cool in my hand. It was a data point, the inciting incident. The first visible crack in a facade I now knew I had to investigate. The meal ended. We stood outside the restaurant, the valet bringing Richard's gleaming German sedan. He clapped Mark on the shoulder, a gesture of ownership. I'll see you at the office Monday, kid. We'll get that new prospectus finalized. He nodded curtly to me. Arthur. Then he and Clara drove off. Mark turned to me, the awkwardness returning. Dad, I can give you a lift. I held up the plastic mug. No, thank you. I think I'll walk. It's a nice evening. He looked relieved. Okay. Well, I'll call you this week. I knew he wouldn't. I watched him get into his own expensive car, a car Richard had likely helped him buy, and drive away. I stood on the pavement for a long time, the sounds of the city buzzing around me. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt. That would come later in the quiet moments. Right now, I was in professional mode. I had a problem to solve. Richard had underestimated me. He saw a quiet, retired engineer in a worn but well-kept suit. My son saw his old, boring dad. They saw a man you could give a $5 mug to while lavishing gifts on someone else. What they didn't know was that men like me, men who spend their lives studying stress and failure points, we are very, very good at seeing things other people miss. And we are exceptionally patient. I started the long walk home, the cheap plastic mug in my coat pocket. My investigation had already begun. My house was quiet when I got back. It had been quiet for 10 years, ever since Helen passed. The silence used to be a crushing weight, but over time, it had become a familiar companion. Tonight, it felt different. It felt like a laboratory, a clean, controlled environment where I could think. I put the plastic mug on the kitchen counter, right in the center, a monument to the evening's events. It looked even more pathetic under the warm kitchen lights. I made a cup of real tea in a heavy, ceramic mug, the one Helen had bought me on our last anniversary, and sat at the dining room table. This was where I had helped Mark with his homework, from simple arithmetic to the complex calculus that he needed for his business degree. I'd paid for that degree. Every penny. I wasn't a wealthy man, but I was a careful one. When Helen got sick, we knew our time was limited, and our savings took a hit. After she was gone, everything I earned, everything I saved, was for Mark. I sold our larger family home and moved into this smaller, more manageable house. I didn't take extravagant vacations. I drove the same reliable car for 15 years. I funneled it all into a top-tier university for him, believing it was the most important foundation I could give him. A flashback, unbidden, bloomed in my mind. Mark, age 10, a year after his mother was gone. We were in the backyard, trying to build a tree house. I was handling the structural parts, of course, explaining load distribution and the importance of cross-bracing. He was supposed to be handing me nails. Instead, I looked down and saw he'd hammered a dozen of them into a scrap piece of wood, trying to spell out Dad. He looked up at me with such earnest pride. "It's strong, right, Dad?" I told him it was the strongest thing I'd ever seen. Where did that boy go? I pushed the memory away. Sentiment was a distraction. I needed to analyze the present, not mourn the past. My relationship with Mark hadn't fractured overnight. The cracks had been forming for 2 years, ever since he'd met Clara, and by extension, her father, Richard Thorne. Richard was everything I wasn't. He was loud where I was quiet, flashy where I was practical. He talked in terms of acquisitions and leverage. I talked about tensile strength and soil compaction. When Mark first brought him over for dinner, Richard had surveyed my home, filled with books and Helen's paintings, with a look of mild amusement. "Arthur, right? Mark tells me you build things. I ensure things don't fall down," I had corrected gently. He'd laughed a loud, booming sound. "Close enough. I'm the one who puts them up. Property development. We're changing the skyline, me and Mark." He'd thrown an arm around my son, who was already working for him part-time. Mark had looked embarrassed, but also flattered. That was the beginning. Richard started buying his way into my son's life, not just with a job, but with a lifestyle. Courtside basketball tickets, weekends on his boat, a new wardrobe. Mark, who had grown up in my world of quiet stability and careful planning, was dazzled. He started using Richard's phrases. "You have to be aggressive. It's all about the optics, Dad." He started to see my life's work not as a noble profession that kept people safe, but as a dusty, boring trade. The world's greatest faff, a mug, wasn't an oversight. It was a symptom of a deeper alignment. Mark no longer saw me. He saw his father through Richard's eyes. A relic. I finished my tea and went to my study. I powered on my old desktop computer. It wasn't a sleek, modern machine like the one Mark probably used, but it was powerful and I knew its architecture intimately. I opened a browser and typed Richard Thorne Development, LLC. The corporate website was slick, full of renderings of glass and steel towers set against perfect sunsets. The About Us page featured a photo of Richard, tanned and smiling, with a quote, "We don't just build buildings, we build futures." Beneath his, a smaller photo of Mark, looking young and eager. Mark Jennings, VP of Financial Strategy. My son, a vice president. I felt a pang, but it wasn't pride. It was suspicion. VP was a title Richard had given him, a bauble to secure his loyalty. I navigated to the project's portfolio. There were a half-dozen completed luxury, residential, and commercial buildings, and one listed as coming soon, The pinnacle. The one Richard had been boasting about at dinner. A 40-story waterfront condominium. A new jewel in the city's crown. I started a new folder on my desktop. I named it Project Thorn. Inside, I created a series of subfolders: financials, permits, contractors, personnel. It was the same structure I used for any forensic investigation. I began with the public records: corporate filings, liens, permits. It was late, but the city's public records portal was always open. I spent hours sifting through digital files, my mind sharp and focused. I wasn't looking for a smoking gun. That's not how it works. You look for the small things, the anomalies. An inspector who signed off on 3 different stages in a single day. A soil testing company I'd never heard of. A permit for concrete pouring that was filed just hours before a major rainstorm was forecast. Small things. Data points. Each one, on its own, was meaningless. But together, they could begin to tell a story. Around 3 a.m., I found the first one. A name on a list of subcontractors for Richard's last completed project, the Meridian Tower. The concrete supplier, Prestige Concrete Solutions. I didn't recognize the name. I'd worked in this city for over 3 decades. I knew every major supplier, every reputable operator. A new player was possible, but for a project of that scale, developers usually stuck with the tried and true. I cross-referenced the corporate registration for Prestige Concrete. It was a new LLC formed only 3 years ago. The registered agent was a holding company. I dug deeper into the holding company, and then I found it. A name I recognized, listed as one of the company's directors. A man named Alistair Finch. I leaned back in my chair. Alistair Finch. I hadn't heard that name in 15 years. He was a site manager I had gotten fired. I'd caught him deliberately falsifying concrete slump test results on a municipal bridge project. He was swapping out the tested, high-grade samples with a cheaper, weaker mix for the actual pour to pocket the difference. It was a dangerous, cynical fraud that could have cost lives. I had reported him, and he was disgraced, losing his license. And now, a company he was quietly involved with was the sole concrete supplier for Richard Thorne's flagship building. The cartoon fish on a plastic mug seemed to be smirking at me from the kitchen. This wasn't just about a hurt father. This was about a pattern. Richard wasn't just arrogant. He surrounded himself with people who cut corners. And people who cut corners always leave a trail. I saved the file, shut down the computer, and went to bed. For the first time since that humiliating dinner, I felt a sense of calm. The pieces were on the board. The next few days, I fell into a routine of quiet, methodical research. On the surface, I was just a retiree puttering around the house. I did my grocery shopping. I worked in the garden. I took my daily walks. But my mind was miles away, deep in the digital archives of the city planning department. I knew I couldn't rely on digital records alone. They could be incomplete, or worse, falsified. I needed to talk to someone. I needed George. George Henderson and I had started at the city around the same time, fresh out of college. I was in the engineering department. He was in inspections. We'd spent the next 30 years as the two sides of the same coin. I designed the theoretical safety. He verified the practical application. He had retired 2 years before I did, and we still met for coffee every other Tuesday. Our next meeting was tomorrow. I knew I had to be careful. George was a stickler for the rules, even in retirement. If he thought I was on some personal vendetta, he'd shut down. I had to approach this as a professional concern. The next morning, I met him at our usual spot, a small, no-frills diner that served coffee that could strip paint. George was already there, reading a newspaper, his glasses perched on the end of his nose. He was a big man, built like a brick wall, with a handshake that could crush walnuts. "Arthur," he grunted, folding his paper. "You're looking serious today." "Just thinking," I said, sliding into the booth. The waitress brought my coffee without asking. I took a sip. It was terrible. It was perfect. "George, I was looking at some of the new downtown developments, just out of curiosity. The Pinnacle, specifically. Richard Thorne's project." George snorted. "Thorne, there's a piece of work. I'll flash that one. Thinks the rules are for little people." This was a better opening than I could have hoped for. His last project was the Meridian, right? I was looking at the contractor list. Saw a concrete supplier I didn't recognize. Prestige Concrete Solutions. George's eyes narrowed slightly. He took off his glasses and began polishing them with a napkin, a sure sign he was thinking. Prestige. Yeah, they're new. Came out of nowhere a few years back. Undercut everyone on price. Thorne uses them exclusively now. Are they any good? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Hard to say, George said, putting his glasses back on. The paperwork is always perfect. Too perfect, maybe. Their on-site test results are always top of the class. Never a single failed batch. In my 30 years, I never saw a record that clean. Not from anyone. Unusual, I said, nodding slowly. The site manager for the Meridian, do you remember who it was? Let me see, he mused, staring at the ceiling. It was a guy Thorne brought in. Slick fella. Name was Miller. Kevin Miller. I filed the name away. It was likely an alias or just a subordinate, but it was another piece of data. George, you remember a guy named Alistair Finch? George's face darkened. He put his coffee cup down with a thud. Finch. Now, there's a name I haven't heard in a while. Slimeball. The concrete fraud on the South Bridge. You nailed him. What about him? I chose my next words carefully. I was doing some digging. Corporate registry stuff. He's listed as a director on the holding company that owns Prestige Concrete. The silence that followed was heavy. George stared at me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought I'd overplayed my hand. Then, he leaned forward, his voice low. Arthur, what are you into? I decided on partial honesty. My son, Mark, worked for Thorne. He's very invested. I was at a dinner with Thorne the other night. The way he talked about the business, about cutting corners, it set off alarms. When I saw Finch's name, it felt familiar. Dangerous. I let that hang in the air. I had framed it as a father's concern, backed by professional suspicion. George, a father and grandfather himself, would understand that. He sighed a long, weary sound. Thorne is well-connected. He throws a lot of money around, hosts fundraisers for city councilors. People in the department are wary of him. He's the kind of guy who, if you cross him, you find your budget cut or your position restructured. So, inspectors might be inclined to look the other way, to accept the perfect paperwork. They might be inclined to not look too hard, George corrected. No one wants to pick a fight they can't win, especially not for a guy whose buildings always seem to pass muster, at least on paper. He took a long drink of his coffee. But you, Arthur, you're not in the department anymore. You're not picking a fight you can't win. You're just a concerned citizen, a retired expert with a bit of time on his hands. He was giving me an opening, a validation. I don't have access to the physical archives anymore, I said. The preliminary site surveys, the full geotechnical reports for the Meridian. The digital stuff is just summaries. George slid a small piece of paper across the table. It was a phone number. That's Sarah Jenkins. She runs the records department at the city annex. A good kid, smart. I was her mentor when she started. Tell her you're a university researcher working on a historical study of downtown construction methods. She'll let you see whatever you need. Just be discreet. I pocketed the number. Thank you, George. Be careful, Arthur, he said, his voice serious again. Thorne is a shark, and if Finch is in his orbit, then it's a shark swimming with a remora. It's a dangerous symbiosis. Don't get bitten. We finished our coffee, talking about our grandkids and the frustrations of modern technology. But the subtext of our conversation lingered. George knew I was hunting, and he had just handed me a map to the hunting grounds. As I walked away from the diner, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. George's warning resonated with me, but didn't deter me. Sharks were predictable. They were driven by a singular, primal impulse. And that predictability was, in itself, a weakness. Richard Thorne thought he was a predator. He was about to learn the difference between a predator and an analyst. A predator attacks. An analyst dismantles. The city annex was a drab, beige building that smelled of old paper and dust bunnies. It was a place where information went to be forgotten, stored in endless rows of gray filing cabinets and cardboard boxes. For me, it was a treasure trove. I called the number George had given me, and a friendly, efficient voice answered. I gave her my prepared story. Arthur Jennings, a retired engineer doing independent research for a paper on the evolution of foundation engineering in our city's specific soil type. Sarah Jenkins sounded intrigued. She told me to come by that afternoon, and she'd have the relevant archives pulled for me. When I arrived, she led me to a small, secluded table in the back corner of a cavernous room. Piled on the table were 3 large document boxes. The labels read, "The Meridian Tower, Geotechnical and Foundation, Vols 1 to 3. "This is everything we have," she said, her eyes bright with academic curiosity. "Soil boring logs, initial surveys, concrete pour schedules, all the raw data. Is this what you were looking for, Mr. Jennings?" "This is perfect, Sarah. Thank you. You have no idea how much this helps." She smiled, pleased to be of assistance to a serious researcher, and left me to my work. I opened the first box. The smell of old paper was thick. I put on a pair of reading glasses and began. For the next 6 hours, I was completely absorbed. This was my element. I wasn't just reading documents. I was reconstructing the very birth of a skyscraper from the ground up. The initial survey maps. The deep earth boring samples, with their careful descriptions of clay, sand, and bedrock layers. The complex calculations determining the number and depth of the concrete piles needed to anchor the massive structure. It was all a language I understood better than spoken English. To a layman, it was a mountain of impenetrable jargon and numbers. To me, it was a story, and like any story, it could have plot holes. For hours, everything seemed in order. The geotechnical report, prepared by a reputable firm, was thorough. It recommended a specific depth for the friction piles and a high-grade, sulfate-resistant concrete mix, standard for the saline-rich soil of the waterfront. The architectural plans reflected these requirements. The initial permits were all in order. It was a solid by-the-book plan. Then I started comparing the plan to the execution records, the daily pour logs, the inspection sign-off sheets. I laid them out, side by side with the blueprints, and I started seeing the tiny dissonances. The signature of one inspector, a junior guy I vaguely knew, appeared on document for foundation pouring on the west side of the site at 10 a.m., and then again on steel reinforcement checks on the east side at 10:15 a.m. Physically impossible for one person to do a thorough job in that time frame across a site that large. He was rubber stamping. I found a materials delivery invoice from Prestige Concrete. It was a carbon copy, faint and hard to read, but the delivery code on the slip, PC AG4, was different from the one specified in the engineer's report, PC AG7SR. I knew the codes. AG4 was a standard, cheaper, all-purpose aggregate mix. AG7 SR was the expensive, high-strength, sulfate-resistant mix required for that location. On paper, it was a tiny difference. A letter, a number. But in the real world, in the foundation of a 30-story building sitting on wet, salty soil, it was the difference between a 100-year lifespan and a 30-year one plagued by spalling, corrosion of the rebar, and eventual structural decay. It was the why. Why Richard could afford to use Prestige Concrete, the company tied to a known fraudster like Alastair Finch. It wasn't just that they were cheaper. They were actively fraudulent, billing for high-grade materials and delivering a lower-grade product. The perfect paperwork George had mentioned was a carefully constructed lie. The on-site tests were faked, just as Finch had done on the bridge project all those years ago. They'd pour a small, perfect test slab with the right concrete for the inspector, then use the cheap stuff for the real foundation. It was cynical, it was dangerous, and it was brilliant in its simplicity. I sat back, the dust motes dancing in the single shaft of light from a high window. My heart wasn't pounding. I felt a cold, professional clarity. I had it. This was the flaw. The Meridian Tower wasn't a jewel in the city's crown. It was a time bomb. But this was just one building. It was in the past. To truly dismantle Richard's empire, I needed to prove he was still doing it. On his new project, the Pinnacle, proving fraud on a completed building would be difficult and expensive. It would require court orders and destructive testing. But proving it on a building currently under construction? That was a different matter entirely. My research had to move from the archives to the field. I took out my phone and made a few discrete photos of the key documents, the invoice, the inspector's log, the engineer's spec sheet. Digital copies for my Project Thorn folder. I thanked a very helpful Sarah Jenkins, telling her my research was off to a fantastic start. She beamed. As I walked out of the annex and into the late afternoon sun, my mind was already shifting to the next phase. Phase 1, data collection, was complete. Phase 2, field verification, was about to begin. Richard Thorne was building his masterpiece, the pinnacle, on a foundation of lies. I was an expert on foundations. It was almost poetic. I thought of my son, Mark, building his financial model for this fraudulent enterprise. He was so proud of his work, so convinced of Richard's genius. He was building his own future on that same faulty foundation. And when it crumbled, and it would crumble, he would go down with it unless I could somehow get him out of the way first. This was no longer just about justice for me. It was about saving my son from the consequences of his own blind ambition. The memory came back to me as I drove past the waterfront construction site for the Pinnacle. It was the first dinner, the one where Mark had brought Clara and her father to my home. I'd made Helen's recipe for pot roast, a meal that had always signified a special occasion in our family. Richard, in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, had picked at it. "So, Arthur," he'd said, swirling his wine, a bottle he brought and made a great show of opening. "Mark tells me you're retired. Enjoying the quiet life?" "I keep busy," I'd replied. "Consulting here and there. Gardening." Richard had shared a look with Clara. It was a look of condescending pity. "Good for you. Staying active is important. Myself, I don't think I could ever retire. I'd be too bored. I need the action, the thrill of the deal. We're about to break ground on the biggest project this city has ever seen. The Pinnacle. It's a legacy project." Mark had jumped in, his voice eager. "Dad, you should see the plans. It's incredible. 40 stories, all glass, state-of-the-art, everything. Richard is putting me in charge of tracking the investment tranches." Richard had smiled, a benevolent king bestowing a favor upon a courtier. The boy's got a good head for numbers. A real asset. It's a shame he didn't get into a more dynamic field from the start. He gestured vaguely around my living room. "Engineering, it's all so solid, so permanent. The money is in the fluid, Arthur. In the deal, not in the concrete." The irony was so thick, I could have choked on it. The money was in the concrete. The stolen money. The fraudulent money. He dismissed my entire life's work. The very discipline that guarantees his legacy project doesn't collapse into a pile of rubble, while actively undermining it for profit. That memory fueled me now. It wasn't just an insult. It was a worldview. A worldview that I was uniquely equipped to dismantle. My plan to get inside the Pinnacle site was taking shape. I couldn't just walk on. Construction sites are tightly controlled, especially high-profile ones. But I had an advantage. I knew the ecosystem. I knew the players, the procedures, the rhythms of a major build. For a week, I simply observed. I'd park a few blocks away and walk to a small park that overlooked the site. I sat on a bench, pretending to read the paper, and I watched. I noted the times for shift changes, the logos on the delivery trucks, the color of the hard hats worn by the different crews, subcontractors, general foremen, engineers, safety officers. I saw prestige concrete solutions trucks coming and going, just as I'd expected. I saw the site manager, a man who matched the description of Kevin Miller, strutting around with a clipboard, all bluster and authority. I needed a way in, a plausible reason to be on that site for a few hours. My old identity as a city-affiliated engineer was too risky. It would raise flags. My new identity as a university researcher was too academic. It wouldn't grant me access to the dirty parts of the site. I needed a third identity. I went back through my old contacts. Men I'd worked with for years. Many were retired like me, but a few were still in the game, running their own small, specialized firms. I found a perfect one, a man named Frank Peterson. Frank ran a small, but highly respected company that specialized in vibration monitoring and analysis. When a construction site is next to existing buildings, especially sensitive historic ones, Frank's company gets hired to install sensors and ensure the pile driving and excavation don't cause damaging tremors. I looked up the location of the Pinnacle. It was right next to the Old City Maritime Museum a historic brick building from the 19th century. I called Frank. Frank, it's Arthur Jennings. Art. My God, man, how are you? I thought you'd be on a golf course somewhere by now. The knees wouldn't have it, Frank. Listen, I'm calling with a strange request. I explained my research project. I told him I was studying the practical effects of modern pile driving on historic masonry and that I needed to get some real-world data and observations. I asked if his company was working on the Pinnacle site. As a matter of fact, we are, he said. The city mandated it because of the museum. My guys are out there every other day checking the sensors. This was it, the key. Frank, would it be possible for me to accompany one of your technicians for a few hours? As an observer, I'd be completely out of the way. I just want to see the process, maybe take a few photos of the monitoring equipment for my paper. There was a pause. You know, my guys can just send you the data logs, right? It's not the same, Frank. I need the qualitative observation, the feel of the place. You know how it is. He knew. Frank was an old-school engineer, too. He understood the difference between a number on a page and the reality on the ground. All right, Art. For you, sure. I got a young guy, Dave, heading out there Thursday morning to calibrate the sensors on the foundation pilings. I'll clear it with him. He'll get you a hard hat and a vest. Just try not to get in the way. That site manager, Miller, is a real piece of work. I'll be a ghost, I promised. Thursday, I had 2 days to prepare. I went to a specialty store and bought a new pair of steel-toed work boots. I dug out my old, worn leather tool belt, though I wouldn't carry any tools. It was part of the costume. I needed to look like I belonged. I also bought a small, high-resolution digital camera, the kind that looks like a simple point-and-shoot but has a powerful lens. My plan was simple. While the technician, Dave, was busy with his sensitive electronic equipment, I would be his shadow. And in the chaotic, noisy environment of a massive construction site, a shadow with a camera can see a great deal. I would focus on the rebar cages being assembled before the concrete pour. I needed clear photos of the grade markings stamped on the steel itself. And I needed to get close to the staging area for the concrete, to see the delivery slips, to maybe even get a sample of the aggregate if the opportunity arose. Every detail of the fraud at the Meridian was now a checklist for the Pinnacle. It was a high-risk plan. One suspicious question from the site manager, one wrong move, and I'd be thrown out, and Richard would be alerted that someone was sniffing around. But as I laid out my gear on Wednesday night, the boots, the belt, the camera, I didn't feel fear. I felt the same focused calm I always felt before starting a difficult analysis. Richard thought his legacy was rising from the ground on that waterfront lot. He had no idea I was about to perform the ultimate stress test. Thursday morning arrived, gray and overcast, a perfect day for my purposes. Bright sun creates harsh shadows and makes sneaking photos more difficult. The muted flat light was a gift. I met Frank's technician, Dave, a man in his late 20s with a serious expression, at a coffee shop a few blocks from the site. He handed me a yellow hard hat and a bright orange safety vest. Frank said you were an old hand, Dave said, sipping his coffee. Just stay with me and don't touch anything. Miller, the site manager, he's a real jerk. He fires subcontractors if they look at him wrong. I'll be invisible, I assured him. I'm just here to observe your equipment. We walked onto the site, and the moment my boots hit the churned-up mud, I felt a strange sense of coming home. The air hummed with the growl of diesel engines, the rhythmic clang of hammers on steel, and the shouts of workers. It was a symphony of creation, and I was there to find the discordant note. Dave led me through the organized chaos to the edge of the massive excavation pit where the foundation was being laid. Giant rebar cages, intricate webs of steel rods, were being assembled by crews of iron workers, ready to be lowered into deep holes before being filled with concrete. It was here, in the very bones of the building, that the fraud would be easiest to spot. Dave went to work, attaching his sensors to a completed concrete pile and checking readings on a laptop. He was immediately absorbed, which was exactly what I'd hoped for. I'm just going to get a wider shot of the area for context, I told him, and he just grunted in acknowledgement. I began to walk, slowly and with purpose, my camera held loosely in my hand. I looked like a curious supervisor, not a spy. My first target was the rebar. I ambled over to a staging area where bundles of the steel rods were stacked. From a distance, all rebar looks the same. But up close, each rod is stamped with a series of codes indicating its grade, its tensile strength, and its manufacturer. The architectural plans, which I had studied until I knew them by heart, specified grade 60 steel. It was standard for a building of this size. I got close to a stack, knelt as if to inspect a tie wire on my boot, and aimed my camera. I zoomed in. The stamp was clear, grade 40. A significantly weaker and cheaper grade of steel. It had a lower yield strength, meaning it would deform under less stress. In a 40-story building, in an area with seismic potential, this was not just fraud, it was criminally negligent. I took several clear shots from different angles, my hand steady despite the surge of cold anger I felt. This confirmed the pattern. Richard wasn't just swapping out concrete. He was compromising the skeleton of the building itself. My next target was the concrete operation. I saw the Prestige concrete truck, its big drum slowly rotating, backing up to a massive pump. I needed to get to the cab to see the delivery ticket that the driver would hand over to the site foreman. I saw Kevin Miller, the manager, yelling at a forklift operator nearby. This was my chance. While all eyes were on Miller's tantrum, I walked calmly on the other side of the concrete truck, a path that put the bulk of the vehicle between me and the manager. The driver had left the ticket on the dashboard, held in place by a clipboard. I raised my camera, angled it through the passenger side window, and snapped a perfect, clear shot of the entire document. The code was right there, mocking me. PC AG4. The same cheaper, all-purpose mix they'd used at the Meridian. Not the specified high-strength mix. I had it. I had the rebar and the concrete. The two core components of the building's structural integrity were both fraudulent. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. It was more than enough. But then I saw an opportunity for one more piece of evidence, something undeniable. Near the pump, a worker had sloppily washed out a wheelbarrow, leaving a puddle of gray water and wet aggregate, the sand and stone that makes up the bulk of concrete. It was waste. No one would notice if a handful of it went missing. I found an empty sample bag in a side pocket of my old tool belt, a relic from a past job. As I walked back toward Dave, I stumbled, catching myself on a stack of plywood. It was a deliberate, controlled fall. In that moment of distraction, my hand scooped up a handful of the wet gravel and slipped it into the bag. It was physical proof. I could have it analyzed in a lab. The report would show its exact composition, proving it wasn't the material specified in the engineering documents. I straightened up, brushing the mud from my hands, my heart beating a little faster now. The risk had paid off. I had everything I needed. I spent another 20 minutes with Dave, asking him intelligent questions about his sensors and the readings he was getting, playing my part to the end. As we walked off the site, I turned back and looked at the rising skeleton of the pinnacle. Richard saw a legacy. Mark saw a future. All I saw now was a lie waiting to be exposed. A structure built on a foundation of pure, unadulterated greed. And I had the evidence in my pocket that would bring the whole thing crashing down. The drive home from the construction site was the longest of my life. The small, heavy bag of wet aggregate in my coat pocket felt like a radioactive isotope, a dense core of pure truth. I resisted the urge to speed, to rush to the next step. My process had always been about methodical patience, and now was not the time to deviate. At home, I carefully laid out the day's acquisitions on my dining room table. The digital camera, my work boots still caked in mud, and the plastic bag of gravel. It looked like the spoils of a strange war. I uploaded the photos to my computer, placing them in a new subfolder within Project Thorn labeled Field Evidence. I opened the images, enlarging them one by one. The rebar grade stamp, 40. The concrete delivery ticket, PC AG4. The images were crisp, undeniable. I then took the bag of aggregate and spread the contents on a clean metal tray to dry. I would send it to a materials testing lab I trusted, one run by a former colleague who valued scientific integrity above all else. I would pay for it myself as an anonymous client. The report would be irrefutable. With the evidence secured, the next part of my plan began: compilation and presentation. It wasn't enough to have the data. The data had to be woven into a narrative so clear, so logical, and so damning that it could not be refuted or dismissed. For the next week, I worked with the focus of a man possessed. My study became a command center. I bought a large whiteboard and set it up on one wall. On it, I began to flowchart the entire fraudulent enterprise. I started with Richard Thorne at the top. Branching from him were his companies. Branching from them were the projects, the Meridian, and the Pinnacle. Under each project, I detailed the specific points of failure. The substandard rebar, the fraudulent concrete mix, the rubber stamping inspectors, the falsified paperwork. I connected Richard to Prestige Concrete through the holding company and its director, the disgraced Alastair Finch. I was creating a visual map of his corruption. Then, I began writing the report. It was not an angry letter or a vindictive accusation. I structured it exactly like one of my old forensic engineering reports. It had a title page, a structural integrity and materials compliance analysis of Thorne Development LLC properties. It had an executive summary, a table of contents, and clearly delineated sections. Section 1. Introduction and Scope of Analysis. Section 2. Analysis of the Meridian Tower. I included the photos of the delivery invoice from the city archives and the inspector's logs, contrasting them with the engineer's original specifications. I calculated the potential reduction in structural lifespan due to the use of non-sulfate-resistant concrete in that specific soil environment. Section 3. Analysis of the Pinnacle project in progress. This was the core of the report. I embedded the high-resolution photos I had taken. The picture of the grade 40 rebar next to a screenshot of the architectural plans specifying grade 60. The photo of the concrete delivery ticket next to the official project requirements. I included a preliminary section for the aggregate analysis, which I would insert as soon as the lab results came back. Section 4. Identification of systemic issues. Here I connected the dots. I showed that the fraud was not an isolated incident, but a deliberate, repeatable business model. I included the corporate registry documents linking Richard's preferred supplier to Alastair Finch, along with a brief, factual summary of Finch's professional history, including his license revocation for materials fraud. Section 5. Conclusion and Risk Assessment. In cold, dispassionate language, I detailed the potential consequences: catastrophic structural failure in a seismic event, accelerated degradation leading to astronomical repair costs, and significant legal and financial liability for the developer, investors, and anyone professionally associated with the project. I explicitly mentioned the risk to public safety. I avoided any emotional language. I used terms like significant deviation from specification, non-compliance with engineering standards, and high probability of premature structural decay. The dispassionate, technical language made it even more chilling. This report was a weapon, a precision-guided missile aimed at the foundation of Richard's entire world. As I was finalizing the draft, the lab report on the aggregate came back. It was exactly as I'd expected. The composition was a cheap, standard mix, completely lacking the chemical additives required for high-strength, long-term durability in a waterfront environment. It was the final, perfect piece of the puzzle. I inserted the lab results into my report, creating the final version. It was 40 pages long, dense with facts, photographs, and professional analysis. It was airtight. Now, for the delivery. My first instinct was to send it to the city, to the district attorney, to the newspapers. But that felt too impersonal. The betrayal that started this was personal. The resolution had to be as well. And more importantly, I had to find a way to shield Mark. If I just dropped this bomb publicly, he, as vice president of financial strategy, would be caught in the blast. He could be seen as complicit, even if he was just a gullible kid blinded by ambition. No, the reveal had to be controlled. It had to happen in a setting of my choosing, a setting that would maximize the psychological impact on Richard and provide Mark with a chance to see the unvarnished truth before the world did. I thought about the Father's Day dinner, the polished table, the condescending smiles. And I decided to host a dinner of my own. I called my son. "Mark," I said, my voice calm and friendly, "I haven't heard from you. I was hoping you, Clara, and Richard might be free for dinner this Saturday. At my house. I'd like to discuss the trust one set up for you. There are some decisions to be made, and I'd value Richard's input. It was the perfect lure. The mention of a trust and valuing Richard's opinion would be irresistible to both of them. It would feed Richard's ego and make Mark feel like he was brokering an important family financial meeting. "Oh, Dad, that's great," Mark said, sounding surprised and pleased. "I'm sure we can make that work. I'll check with Richard and call you back." He called back within the hour. They would be there. Saturday at 7. The stage was set. I made 4 copies of the report, one for each of them, and one for my lawyer, who I had already briefed and who was standing by. The trap was laid. All I had to do now was wait for the sharks to swim into it. The hours leading up to the dinner were strangely calm. I didn't fuss over the meal. I ordered food from a good Italian restaurant. Nothing extravagant, just simple, well-made lasagna. The focus was not on the food. I set the dining room table, the same table where I had once helped Mark with his homework. I used my everyday plates, not the good china. I wanted the setting to be mundane, normal. The contrast would make the coming detonation all the more stark. At precisely 7 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find the 3 of them standing on my porch. Richard was dressed in expensive casual wear, a cashmere sweater that probably cost $1,000. He had a bottle of wine in his hand and a smug, proprietary smile on his face, as if he were visiting a quaint but insignificant part of his empire. Clara looked bored. Mark looked nervous, fidgeting with his cuffs. He was caught between his 2 worlds, his 2 fathers, and the tension was visible. "Arthur, good to see you," Richard boomed, stepping inside and handing me the wine without making eye contact. He surveyed the room. Cozy. It was not a compliment. "Richard, Clara. Mark, come in, make yourselves comfortable," I said, my voice even. I led them to the dining room. They sat, and I served the lasagna and salad. The initial conversation was stilted. Richard did most of the talking, holding forth on the booming real estate market and the brilliant progress at the Pinnacle. "We're ahead of schedule and under budget," he boasted, looking at Mark. "This kid's a genius at finding efficiencies." Mark blushed with pride. I let him talk. I let him build his own pedestal, brick by arrogant brick. I ate my lasagna, listened patiently, and waited for the right moment. After we had finished the main course, as Clara was picking at her salad, I cleared my throat. The small sound cut through Richard's monologue. "Thank you all for coming," I began. As I mentioned to Mark, I wanted to discuss the trust one established for him years ago. Richard leaned forward, his interest piqued. This was the part he'd come for. The money. "It's a significant trust," I continued, looking directly at my son. "It represents my life's work, everything I saved for you after your mother passed. And a trustee has a fiduciary duty to ensure the beneficiary's assets are not exposed to undue risk. Which brings me to the real reason for this dinner." I reached down to a briefcase I had placed by my chair. I pulled out the 3 bound copies of my report. They were heavy and made a solid, satisfying sound as I placed them on the table. One in front of Richard, one in front of Clara, one in front of Mark. Richard looked at the cover, his brow furrowed in confusion. A structural integrity and materials compliance analysis of Thorn Development LLC properties. He looked up at me, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "What is this? Some kind of joke, Arthur?" "Read the executive summary," I said quietly. Page 1. Mark opened his copy, his hands trembling slightly. Clara just stared at hers, as if it were a dead animal. Richard, with a dismissive sigh, opened the report. I watched his face. It was a study in disintegration. The initial look of smug confusion slowly dissolved as he read. His eyes, which had been darting around arrogantly, became fixed on the page. The muscles in his jaw tightened. His face lost its tan, a sickly, pale gray spreading from his neck upwards. He flipped a page, then another, faster and faster. He saw the photos of the rebar, the copy of the concrete ticket. His hand started to shake. Mark was frozen, staring at page 1. I could see the words reflecting in his wide eyes. Systemic materials fraud, significant deviation from specification, high probability of premature structural decay. This is libel. Richard finally choked out, slamming the report down on the table. The sound was loud in the quiet room. "This is slander. You have no proof." "Turn to Appendix Richard," I said calmly. "That's the high-resolution photograph of the grade 40 rebar stamp at the Pinnacle site, taken last Thursday. Appendix B is the photograph of the delivery ticket for the substandard concrete. Appendix C is the certified lab analysis of the aggregate I collected from your site. It is proof. It is verifiable, scientific proof." Richard stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. The arrogant mask had shattered, and behind it was a panicked, cornered animal. He knew. He knew I had him. "You were on my site?" he whispered, the words barely audible. I confirmed. "You see, Richard, you made a critical error. You dismissed me. You saw an old man, a boring engineer. You didn't understand that my entire life has been dedicated to finding the exact kind of flaws you build your empire on. You talked about your legacy. The problem is you built it out of cheap materials, and it's about to collapse." I turned my attention to my son. His face was ashen. He was looking back and forth between the report in his hands and Richard's terrified face. The reality of his situation was dawning on him, a slow, horrifying sunrise. He wasn't a financial genius in a dynamic company. He was the vice president of a criminal enterprise. "Mark," I said, my voice softening slightly, "I did this for two reasons. First, because men like Richard, who endanger the public for profit, must be stopped. It's my professional obligation. But more importantly, I did this to protect you. Everything you have, your job, your car, your future, is tied to this fraud. When it implodes, you'll be destroyed with it. This report is your way out. It's your proof that you were unaware, a victim of his deception, just like his investors and the people who will one day live in those buildings." Clara finally spoke, her voice shrill. "You can't do this. You'll ruin us." Richard suddenly lunged across the table, his face contorted with rage. He wasn't trying to hit me. He was trying to grab the reports. I didn't flinch. "It's too late for that, Richard," I said, holding his gaze. "As of an hour ago, a fourth copy of that report was delivered to my lawyer. He has instructions. If I don't call him by a specific time tonight, he is to forward it to the district attorney's office, the state engineering licensing board, and the lead investigative reporter at the city's major newspaper. Your legacy is already over. The only question now is how you manage the fallout." Richard froze, his hand hovering over the report. He sank back in his chair, utterly defeated. The fight was gone. There was only the cold, stark reality of the trap he had walked into. I looked at my son, who was staring at me now, not with anger, but with a dawning, horrified understanding. The Father's Day gift, the watch, the cruise, the condescension, it all clicked into place for him in that moment. He saw Richard not as a powerful benefactor, but as the man who had used him, who had put his entire future at risk. And he saw me, his boring, old-fashioned father, as the only one who had seen the truth. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of total demolition. The aftermath was not a single, explosive event, but a slow, grinding collapse. Richard and Clara left my house that night in a state of stunned silence. There were no more threats, no more blustering. I had shown them the schematics of their own destruction, and they knew it was flawless. I did not make the call to my lawyer to stop the report's dissemination. I let the clock run out. The consequences began to unfold with grim predictability. The investigative reporter, a tenacious woman named Susan Vance, was the first to strike. Her front-page story, titled "The Pinnacle of Fraud," was a meticulously researched bombshell. It featured quotes from unnamed engineering experts. I provided her with a list of reputable colleagues, details from my report, and a damning non-denial from Richard's hastily hired crisis PR team. The story set off a firestorm. The district attorney's office, publicly named and shamed for its slowness, launched a major investigation. The city slapped a stop-work order on the Pinnacle, turning the half-finished monument to greed into a silent, rust-colored skeleton. Investors, seeing their money tied up in a fraudulent and now worthless project, filed a massive class action lawsuit. Richard Thorne's empire, built on a foundation of lies, crumbled just as I had predicted. His assets were frozen. He was deposed, indicted, and ultimately faced a slate of charges ranging from wire fraud to reckless endangerment. Alastair Finch and his Prestige Concrete were also swept up in the investigation, their entire operation exposed as a long-running scam. The Meridian Tower, his previous project, became the subject of its own lawsuit from the Homeowners Association, facing the prospect of hundreds of millions of dollars in remedial work. Richard's legacy was not a glass tower, but a mountain of legal bills and a reputation reduced to rubble. Mark was caught in the middle, but just as I had intended, my reports served as a shield. He immediately resigned from Thorn Development, hired his own lawyer, and fully cooperated with the DEA's investigation. He provided them with all the financial models and prospectuses he had worked on, which, when viewed through the lens of my report, became evidence of the scale of Richard's deception. Mark was treated as a key witness, a dupe, rather than a co-conspirator. His youthful ambition had made him blind, not criminal. He and Clara separated. Her loyalty, it turned out, was tied directly to her father's net worth. She saw Mark not as a husband, but as a failed asset. One evening, about 2 months after the dinner, Mark came to my house. He looked older, thinner. The flashy confidence was gone, replaced by a weary humility. He stood in my doorway, unable to meet my eye. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. I stepped aside and let him in. We sat in the living room, the silence between us thick with unspoken words. I brought you something," he said, handing me a small, heavy box. I opened it. Inside was a watch. It was simple, elegant, with a clean steel case and a leather strap. It was a beautiful, understated timepiece from a reputable but not ostentatious brand. It was a watch I would actually wear. "I sold a car," he explained. "The one Richard helped me buy. I used some of the money for this. The rest is going to my legal fees." He finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a pain that I knew all too well. "Dad, I am so sorry. For everything. For the dinner. For the mug. For not listening. For not seeing." "I know, Mark," I said softly. "You were impressed by him. He offered you a world I never could." "It wasn't a real world," he said, shaking his head. "It was a mirage. You build real things, Dad. Things that are solid. Things that are true. I forgot that. I'm so sorry." I didn't need the apology, but I could see that he needed to give it. We talked for hours that night for the first time in years. He told me about the pressure, the seduction of the wealth and power Richard represented. I told him about my investigation, not to gloat, but to explain my thought process, my motivations. I wanted him to understand it wasn't an act of revenge against him, but an act of protection for him. It was the beginning of a long, slow process of rebuilding. Our relationship would never be the same as it was when he was a boy spelling my name with nails in the backyard. Too much had happened, but it could become something new, something stronger, perhaps, something tested. Today, a year has passed. Richard Thorne accepted a plea bargain and is serving a sentence in a low-security federal prison. The pinnacle stands as a half-finished monument to his folly, tangled in legal battles that will likely last for decades. Mark has taken a modest job as a financial analyst at a small, stable firm. He's paying his dues. He's learning. He calls me every Sunday. We don't talk about watches or cruises. We talk about his work, my garden, the state of the world. It's a quiet, normal relationship. It's real. I still have the $5 plastic mug. I keep it in my study on a bookshelf. It sits there not as a reminder of the hurt, but as a reminder of a principle that has guided my entire professional life. The most insignificant detail, the smallest, cheapest, most overlooked object, can sometimes be the first sign of a catastrophic structural flaw. I spent my life ensuring the foundations of buildings were solid. It was only when my own family's foundation began to crack that I learned the most important lesson of all. You have to apply the same rigorous analysis to your life as you do to your work. You have to test everything. You have to be willing to see the flaws, no matter how much you wish they weren't there. Only then can you be sure that what you're building is made to last.